Chapter 10. We stood in complete dismay, I did, at any rate, for about as long as it takes to peel a potato. There would be no doubt in which direction the van had moved, for the track of the wheels was plain. It had gone farther up the lane towards the quarry. In the earth, which was still soggy, were a number of footprints. "By the bones of Polycarp," exclaimed the professor, "those hobos have stolen the van. I guess they think it'll make a fine Pullman sleeper for them. If I had realized there was more than one of them, I'd have hung around closer. They need a lesson." Good Lord, I thought, here's Don Quixote about to wade into another fight. Hadn't we better go back and get Mr. Pratt, I asked. This was obviously the wrong thing to say. It put the fiery little man all the more on his mettle. His beard bristled. "Nothing of the sort. Those fellows are cowards and vagabonds anyway. They can't be far off. You haven't been away for more than an hour, have you? If they've done anything to balk, by the bones of Chaucer, I'll harry them." I thought I heard him bark. He hurried up the lane. I followed him in a panicky frame of mind. The track wound along a hillside between a high bank and a forest of birch trees. I think the distance can't have been more than a quarter of a mile. Anyway, in a very few minutes the road made a sharp twist to the right, and we found ourselves looking down into the quarry over a sheer rocky drop of 100 feet at least. Below, drawn into one side, stood Parnassus. Peg was between the shafts. Bach was nowhere to be seen. Sitting by the van were 3 disreputable-looking men. The smoke of a cooking fire rose in the air. Evidently, they were making free with my larder. "Keep back," said the professor softly. "Don't let him see us." He flattened himself against the grass and crawled to the edge of the cliff. I did the same, and we lay there invisible from below, but quite able to see everything in the quarry. The 3 tramps were evidently enjoying an excellent breakfast. "This place is a regular hangout for these fellows," Mifflin whispered. "I've seen hobos about here every year. They go into winter quarters about the end of October usually. There's an old blasted-out section of this quarry that makes a sheltered dormitory for them. And, as the place isn't worked anymore, they're not disturbed here, so long as they don't make mischief in the neighborhood. We'll give them—" "Hands up," said a rough voice from behind us. I looked around. There was a fat, red-faced, villainous-looking creature covering us with a shiny revolver. It was an awkward situation. Both the professor and I were full length on the ground. We were quite helpless. "Get up," said the tramp in a husky, nasty voice. "I guess yous thought it wasn't covering your trail. Well, you get to tie you up, I reckon, and get away with this crystal palace of yourn." I scrambled to my feet, but to my surprise the professor continued to lie at full length. "Get up, deacon," said the tramp again. "Get up on them graceful limbs, if you please." I guess he thought himself safe from attack by a woman. At any rate, he bent over as if to grab Mifflin by the neck. I saw my chance and jumped on him from behind. I'm heavy, as I said, and he sprawled on the ground. My doubts as to the pistol being loaded were promptly dissolved, for it went off like a cannon. Nobody was in front of it, however, and Mifflin was on his feet like a flash. He had the ruffian by the throat, kicked the weapon away to his hand, and I ran to seize it. "You son of Satan," said the valiant Redbeard. "Thought you could bully us, did you? Miss McGill, you were as quick as Joan of Arc. Hand me the pistol, please." I gave it to him, and he shoved it under the hobo's nose. "Now, take off that rag around your neck." The rag was an old red handkerchief, inconceivably soiled. The tramp removed it, grumbling and whining. Mifflin gave me the pistol to hold while he tied our prisoner's wrists together. In the meantime, we heard a shout from the quarry, and the 3 vagabonds were gazing up in great excitement. "You tell those fashion plates down there," said Mifflin, as he nodded the hands to it, "that if they make any fight, I'll shoot 'em like crows." His voice was cold and savage, and he seemed quite master of the situation. But I must confess I wondered how we'd handle 4 of them. The greasy ruffian shouted down to his pals in the quarry, but they didn't hear what he said. And just then the professor asked me to keep our captive covered while he got a stick. I stood with the pistol pointed at his head while Mifflin ran back to cut a cudgel. Tramp's face became the color of the underside of a fried egg as he looked into the muzzle of his own gun. "Say, lady," he pleaded, "that gun goes off awful easy. Point her somewhere else, or you'll croak me by mistake." I thought a good scare wouldn't do him any harm, and I kept the barrel steadily on him. The rascals down below seemed debating what to do. I don't know whether they were armed or not, but probably they imagined that there were more than two of us. At all events, by the time Mifflin came back with a stout birch staff, they were hustling out of the quarry on the other side. The professor swore and looked as if he would gladly give chase, but he refrained. "Here, you," he said in crisp tones to the tramp, "march on ahead of us down to the quarry." The fat ruffian shambled awkwardly down the trail. We had to make quite a detour to get into the quarry, and by the time we reached there were 3 other tramps who'd gotten clean away. I was not sorry, to tell the truth. I thought the professor had enough scrapping for 24 hours. Peg whinnied loudly as she saw us coming, but Bach was not in sight. "What have you done with the dog, you swine?" said Mifflin. "If you've hurt him, I'll make you pay with your own hide." Our prisoner was completely cowed. "No, boss, we ain't hurt the dog," he fawned. "We tied him up so he wouldn't bark, that's all. He's in the bus." Sure enough, by the time we could hear smothered yelping and whining from Parnassus. I hurried to open the door, and there was Bach, his jaws tied together with a rope end. He bounded out and made super canine efforts to express his joy at seeing the professor again. He paid very little attention to me. "Well," said Mifflin, after freeing the dog's muzzle, and with difficulty restraining him from burying his teeth in the tramp's shin, "what shall we do with this heroic specimen of manhood? Shall we cart him over to the jail in Port Vigor, or shall we let him go?" The tramp burst into a whining appeal that he was almost funny. It was so abject. The professor cut it short. "I ought to pack you into quad," he said. "Are you the Phoebus Apollo 1 scuffled down into the lane last night? Were you skulking around the wagon then?" "No, boss, that was Split-Lip Sam, honest to God it was. He came back, boss, he'd been fighting with a cat a mountain. Say, boss, you sure hit him hard. One of his lamps is a puddin'. Boss, I swear I ain't had nothing to do with it." "I don't like your society," said the professor, "and I'm going to turn you loose. I'm going to count to 10, and if you're not out of the quarry by then, I'll shoot, and if I see you again, I'll skin you alive. Now get out." He cut the knotted handkerchief in 2. The hobo needed no urging. He spun on his heel and fled like a rabbit. The professor watched him go, and as the fat, ungainly figure burst through the hedge and disappeared, he fired the revolver into the air to frighten him some more. Then he tossed the weapon into the pool nearby. "Well, Miss McGill," he said with a chuckle, "if you like to undertake breakfast, I'll fix up Peg." He drew the horseshoe from his pocket once more. A brief inspection of Parnassus satisfied me that the thieves had not done any real damage. They had gotten most of the eatables and spread out a flat rock in preparation for a feast. They tracked a good deal of mud, but otherwise I could see nothing amiss. So while Mifflin busied himself with Peg's foot, it was easy for me to get a meal underway. I found a gush of clean water trickling down the face of a rock. There were still some eggs and bread and cheese in the cupboard, an open tin of condensed milk. I gave Peg her nosebag of oats and fed Bach, who was frisking about in high spirits. By the time the shoeing was done and the professor and I sat down to an improvised meal, I was beginning to feel as if this gypsy existence were the normal course of my life. "Well, Professor," I said. I handed him a cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and cheese. "For a man who slept in a wet haystack, you acquit yourself with excellent valor." "Old Parnassus is quite a stormy petrel," he said. "I used to think the chief difficulty in writing a book would be inventing things to happen. But if I were to sit down and write the adventures I'd had with her, it would be a regular odyssey." "How about Peg's foot?" I asked. "Can she travel on it?" "It'll be all right if you go easy. I've scraped out the injured part and put the shoe back. I'll keep a little kit of tools under the van for emergencies of all sorts." It was chilly, and we didn't dawdle over our meal. I only made a feint of eating, as I had little breakfast before. Also, the events of the last few hours had left me rather restless. I wanted to get Parnassus out on the highway again, to jog along in the sun and think things over. The quarry was a desolate, forbidding place anyway. But before we left, we explored the cave where the tramps had been preparing to make themselves comfortable for the winter. It's not really a cave, but only a shaft in a cliff. A screen of evergreen boughs protected the opening against the weather. Inside there were piles of sacking that had evidently been used as beds, many old grocery boxes for tables and chairs. It amused me to notice a cracked fragment of mirror balanced on the corner of a rock. Even these ragamuffins apparently were not totally unconscious of personal appearance. I seized the opportunity while the professor was giving Peg a final look to rearrange my hair, which was emphatically a sight. I hardly think Andrew would have recognized me that morning. We led Peg up a steep incline and back into the lane where I'd strayed, and at length we reached the main road again. Here I began to lay down the law to Redbeard. "Now look here, Professor," I said, "I'm not going to have you tramp all the way back to Fort Vigor. After the night you've had, you need a rest. You just climb into Parnassus and lie down for a good snooze. I'll drive until Woodbridge and you can take your train there. Now you get right into that bunk and I'll sit out here and drive." He demurred, but without much emphasis. I think the little fool was about fagged out, and no wonder. I was a trifle groggy myself. In the end he was quite docile. He climbed into the van, took off his boots, lay down under a blanket. Bach followed, and I think they both fell asleep on an instant. I got in the front seat and took the reins. I didn't let Peg go more quickly than a walk. I wanted to spare her sore foot. My, what a morning that was after the rain. The road ran pretty close to the shore, and every now and then I catch a glimpse of the water. The air was keen, not just ordinary unnoticed air that we breathe in and out, but a sharp and tingling essence, as strong as the nostrils as camphor or ammonia. The sun seemed focused upon Parnassus, and we moved along the white road in a flush of golden light. The flat fronds of the cedars swayed gently in the salty air, and for the first time in 10 years, I should think, I began amusing myself by selecting words to describe the goodness of the morning. I even imagined myself writing a description of it, as if I were Andrew or Thoreau. The crazy little professor had inoculated me with his literary bug, I guess. And then I did a dishonorable thing. Just by chance I put my hand into the pocket seat where Mifflin had left a few odds and ends. I meant to have another look at that card of his and the poem on it, and there I found a funny battered little notebook, evidently forgotten. On the cover was written in ink, "Thoughts on the Present Discontents." That title seemed vaguely familiar. I seemed to recall something of the kind from my own school days, more than 20 years ago, goodness me. Of course, I had been honorable, I wouldn't have looked into it, but the kind of quibbling self-justification I recalled that I had bought Parnassus and all that it contained, lock, stock, barrel, and bung, as Andrew used to say, and so the notebook was full of little jottings, written in pencil in the professor's small, precise hand. The words were rubbed and soiled, but plainly legible, and I read this. "I don't suppose Bach or Peg get lonely, but by the bones of Ben Gunn I do. Seems silly when Herrick and Hans Andersen and Tennyson and Thoreau and a whole wagon-load of other good fellows are riding at my back. I can hear them all talking as we trundle along, but books aren't a substantial world after all. And every now and then we get hungry for some closer, more human relationships. I've been totally alone now for 8 years except for Runt, and he might be dead and never say so. This wandering about is fine in its way, but it must come to an end some day. A man needs to put down a root somewhere to be really happy. What absurd victims of contrary desires we are. If a man is settled in one place, he yearns to wander. When he wanders, he yearns to have a home. And yet, how bestial is content. All the great things in life are done by discontented people. There are 3 ingredients in the good life: learning, earning, and yearning. A man should be learning as he goes, and he should be earning bread for himself and others, and he should be yearning too, yearning to know the unknowable. What a fine old poem, The Pulley by George Herbert. Those Elizabethan fellows knew how to write. They were marred perhaps by their idea that poems must be witty. Remember how Bacon said that reading poets makes one's witty. There he gave a clue to the literature of his time. Their fantastic puns and conceits are rather out of fashion nowadays, but Lord, the root of the matter was in them. How gallantly, how reverently they tackle the problems of life. When God at first made man, says George Hebert, he had a glass of blessings standing by, so he pours on man all the blessings in his reservoir: strength, beauty, wisdom, honor, pleasure, and then he refrains from giving the last of them, which is rest, i.e., contentment. God sees that if man is contented, he will never win his way to him. Let man be restless, so that if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Some day I shall write a novel on that theme and call it The Pulley. In this tragic, restless world, there must be some place where at last we can lay our heads and be at rest. Some people call it death. Some call it God. My ideal of a man is not the Omar who wants to shatter into bits this sorry scheme of things and then remold it nearer to his heart's desire. Old Omar was a coward, and his silk pajamas and his glass of wine. Real name is George Herbert, seasoned timber, the fellow who does handily and well whatever comes to him. Even if it's only shoveling coal into a furnace, he can balance the shovel neatly, swing the coal square on the fire, and not spill it on the floor. If it's only splitting kindling or running a trolley car, he can make a good artistic job of it. If it's only writing a book or peeling potatoes, he can put it into the best he has. Even if he's only bald-headed old fool over 40 selling books on a country road, he can make an ideal of it. Good old Parnassus. It's a great game. I think I'll have to give her up soon, though. I must get that book of mine written. But Parnassus has been a great, true glass of blessings to me. There was much more in the notebook. Indeed, it was half full of jotted paragraphs, memoranda, and scraps of writing. Poems, I believe some of them were. But I'd seen enough. It seemed as if I had stumbled unawares onto the pathetic, brave, and lonely heart of the little man. I'm a commonplace creature, I'm afraid, insensible of so many of the deeper things in life, but every now and then, like all of us, I come face to face with something that thrills me. I saw how this little red-bearded peddler was like a cake of yeast in the big, heavy dough on humanity, how he traveled about trying to fulfill his own way, his ideals of beauty. I felt almost motherly toward him. I wanted to tell him that I understood him, and in a way, I felt ashamed of having run away from my own homely tasks. My kitchen, my hen yard, and dear old hot-tempered, absent-minded Andrew. I fell into a sober mood. As soon as I was alone, I thought I would sell Parnassus and hurry back to the farm. That was my job. That was my glass of blessings. What was I doing, a fat, middle-aged woman traipsing along the roads with a cartload of books I didn't understand? I slipped the little notebook back into the hiding place. I would have died rather than let the professor know I had seen it.